So Terri, tell me a little bit about your organization.
So Covenant Retirement Communities has 16 communities in 9 states, all 4 time zones. We have 12 CCRCs, and then we have 1 skilled nursing, 2 rental communities, and a freestanding assisted living.
And does each have their own board of directors?
No, we have 1 national board that works just at the national level with board members from around the country.
And I understand that you have residents on your board. That's a topic that a lot of people debate about and question. Tell me how that came about and how that works for you.
Sure. So we're located in 3 states, or in 9 states, but 3 of them have the requirements that there be resident representation at the board meetings. And that's Michigan, Florida, and California. So out of our 20-member board, we have 2 voting residents. And in addition to that, we have 12 residents that represent each one of our CCRCs that participate at every board meeting, although they're non-voting.
How do they participate? They're not present, are they?
They are present. And
Really?
so our board sits at a board table along with the 2 voting residents. And then our residents are in the room for our general session board, kind of in the back of the room.
Okay.
And then, but they're excused for executive session, which is things that we cover: compliance, legal, any HR issues.
So how has that worked out for you with resident participation?
So it does take a lot of planning because each of our board meetings meet in a different community around the country. So we travel in about a pack of 35 between the residents, our 20 board members, and then the staff that participate.
Wow.
So it is a big event, and so the logistics of planning for a board meeting are just as complicated and preparing for a board meeting as the board meeting itself. The residents, so how the board meeting works is that the agenda, we go through the agenda. Where there's discussion, the board chair asks for the board discussion first, and then the residents have the opportunity to ask questions or weigh in anything that they didn't hear around the board discussion.
Interesting. So
Yeah.
are there ever times when the residents are at odds with what the board has been discussing, or they have a dissenting opinion to what's on the table?
So the residents have been involved in attending our board for several years now. You know, I will say one thing that I think is important is that the resident participation, while it's logistically and it does add to the complexity of the board meetings, I will say that the residents have a really good understanding of the challenges and how the board makes decisions and the complexity of the organization. And even in the hardest decisions and discussions, how the board really wrestles with some difficult. So I will say the residents have probably added, they've added a lot of value from a couple of different perspectives. Number one, they're great advocates back at the community because they now understand better around the challenges of governance and the complexity. And so that has been really helpful for us in terms of just them going back. So we've gotten a lot better at how we prepare the residents for the board meetings. So our board meets, starts at noon on Friday and goes to about noon on Saturday. On Friday morning, there's about a 2.5-hour session between just the resident representatives to the board. And it's their time to do some sharing. They ask each other questions. However, I will tell you, they start to compare practices and pricing, and so that's very interesting. It does hold us a little bit more accountable to the consistency of how we run the organization from community to community. But we do have a staff member in that meeting, and so one of the things that we've been able to do is pull out some of those more complicated agenda topics. We walk through it with the residents on the front end in that Friday morning session. They can ask a lot of questions.
They're well prepared.
So that when they get to the board meeting,
Yeah.
they just have a better sense of what that topic is about.
Makes sense.
Yes, we've had dissension between where the residents think and what the board thinks. The board is ultimately the decision maker.
Sure.
The residents' opinions or their questions or their concerns definitely weigh in to the board discussions, but it just takes a really strong board chair to make sure that you get that the board is the first discussion, that they end up making the decision while still hearing from the residents and maintaining some order and then making sure that they don't overrun time.
Sure. How are the residents selected that participate?
So the resident reps are selected by the resident council at that community.
Okay. So is there ever a concern, there are always some residents who are very opinionated or a little bit of a rabble rouser. Does that happen? Has that happened to you?
Yes, we have some residents are much more vocal than other residents. However, we're seeing that residents do have a lot of opinions. I think one of the most important, there's two things that we have done with our board meetings. Number one, it's critical that they go through an orientation. So every year before our annual meeting, which is in July, where all the new resident reps start, we do an orientation between myself and the board chair. It's about 4 hours. It's on video conference, and we really encourage every single resident representative to attend, even if they're continuing on from a prior term. And so we do that orientation every year just to make sure that they really understand their role, the governance process, and then just the logistics of getting to the board meeting.
Sure.
The second thing that we've done in our board agenda is we have identified topics that are confidential. And the residents sit in on those confidential topics, but at the end of the board meeting, we compile a specific resident notes that they then can bring back to their community to report on the board meeting for consistency from community to community more than anything, and then just help them navigate the complexity of how they explain what they've heard. In those board notes back for the residents, anything on the agenda marked confidential, they cannot talk about outside of the board meeting, and it is not written in the resident notes. And so that way things that might be around new businesses or construction or some of those things that we haven't completely decided on, or we might be vetting a new idea or a concept, doesn't prematurely get out to the campuses. We've had challenges with that before.
Yeah, I would think so. So for other members who are considering putting residents on their board, are there some bits of advice that you would give them?
Two really big things. I would make three. I would make sure that they have some sort of forum ahead of time to be able to talk through some of the more difficult topics on the agenda, just to give the residents a chance to kind of vet through it themselves before the board meeting. I would make sure that you prepared board meeting notes so that there's consistency of communication back to the campuses. And I would absolutely make sure there is a very clear orientation process with information that they have. They do sign a confidentiality statement, so if anything confidential is talked about outside of the board meeting, they know that it could mean that they would lose their opportunity to be representative. However, what we have found is that the residents appreciate that confidentiality because, of course, it gives them the statement that they can't talk about certain things. And it gives them kind of something to stand on so that they're not pressured by residents for every detail of every meeting.
That's great. Thank you so much. This was really helpful. I appreciate it.
Thanks. It was great.